Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great honor and privilege for me to introduce our RISICA lecturer today. But first, I'd like to acknowledge Tony RISICA. Where's Tony? Oh, so Tony RISICA, who endowed this lecture series, is with us today. So it's quite an honor. So thank you. So the RISICA lecture we try to do every semester, and we bring together leaders from business and industry. And it's a great honor and privilege today to be able to introduce Jim Cafone. So Jim is an alumnus of URI, a two-time alumnus, 1988 industrial engineering bachelor's degree, and a 1990 master's degree in manufacturing engineering, and then went on to get another master's MBA or MBA from University of Pennsylvania. And so, one of the great privileges of my job as dean is to meet all of our fantastic alumni. And it's been a great honor to get to know Jim over the past couple of months. And so Jim's he's a senior vice president for global supply chain at Pfizer. And the story that he's going to tell is really, I mean, in the scheme of things, it's probably one of the great stories in the history of, the human race when you think about it. And so with no further comments, I'll turn it over to Jim. So thank you.
Great. So thank you. It's really great to be back here. So thank you so much for everybody coming here today. So what I'm going to do here today is represent thousands and thousands of colleagues here for Pfizer, and what we did sort of during the vaccine pandemic. And I think it's important to really state that up front, because what you're going to see here is the collection of just millions and millions of people hours that worked for the common good of patients, and worked for the common good of in my mind, trying to solve probably the world's greatest health problem in the last God knows how long, but to the scale of doing that at billions and billions of volume for billions and billions of people. Okay. So what I thought I would do is there's one or two things I talk about here, and let's see if I can bring this down. But maybe what I would like to do is first start is just to say like how this occurred. So what we were able to do within this sort of healthcare crisis is bring all sorts of functions and all sorts of people and backgrounds together from all over the world. And that's going to be my story. My story is going to be about Pfizer, but it's also going to be about the many people that contributed to this that were outside of Pfizer also. So we brought together sort of the entire healthcare community on this. And I sort of use it in this analogy, right? I think hopefully everybody knows this picture. I downloaded it yesterday, so it looked really good. But I remember walking around the campus, and, as an engineer, you spend many, many days in the engineering and the physics building. You didn't necessarily spend as many times in the business building and some of the other areas. But I think what you're going to see here within the vaccine is the fact that we had leveraged all sorts of people, all sorts of academic backgrounds, anything we could in order to get this vaccine to market. So we had obviously scientists, biologists, pharmacists, we had engineers, we certainly had chemists, we certainly had communications people, we even had history people on these teams to go through past pandemics, what happened, disease load, those sorts of things to now. So it was probably the greatest thing to bring everybody together. So you can kind of draw an analogy, and I used it earlier, is we were sort of in the same situation, in Pfizer, where we had different sort of specialities, and we were able to bring everybody together in a center and solve a world's problem. So this is sort of what I think about, and I've used this slide before, whenever I talk to university settings, is we were able to bring together many, many different people. So what you'll see here in this diagram is, the person on the left is the scientist, and the person on the right is the creative right brain person, right? So we have the scientists on the left working with the right brain people on the right. And that's one of the key problems or one of the key reasons why we were successful. So Pfizer overall, I'll spend 2 slides on this, and then I promise you I won't give you any more sort of an hour from our sponsor. But I think it's good to show you kind of who we are, right? So, and what's really critical here is to look at 35 manufacturing sites, 86,000 colleagues around the world, okay? We sell our products in 181 countries. And that's a pretty important thing to do because when we were talking about the pandemic, we wanted to be able to offer that product to patients in 181 countries. If you go to the UN list, there's about 187, 88 countries in the world. We operate in 181, okay? And with that, of the 86,000 colleagues, there's 30,000 of those are in our manufacturing supply chain, okay? This is where those 36 manufacturing plants are around the world. It's not important on the locations, but what you can see here is we're basically in every geography and every country. Each one of these manufacturing plants that are here have a speciality. So if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see, you know, we have 5 plants that produce active pharmaceutical ingredients, right? And those APIs get manufactured into pills or capsules in our solids network. And we also have local solids network, and those are more for emerging markets. But those top 3 buckets of plants are all the ones where they're solid oral dose pharmaceuticals. Where the vaccine came out of, which was our biological network, out of the 10 biotech plants and then the 8 sterile injectable sites, just to give you some background. So if you're a biologist in the room, you're coming from the arts and sciences. If you're a pharmacist in the room, you're coming from, you know, you're in the API sort of solids world. That's sort of the way that I would sort of describe it. So the organization that I run, and I just wanted to sort of put this out there because it kind of shows you the breadth of the tapestry of people we had to bring together to solve all this. So a couple of important numbers. So we sell 17,000 SKUs globally. If you walk into your average supermarket has 40,000 SKUs, stock keeping units. So 20 aisles, 40,000 SKUs, you get about 2,000 an aisle or so, you know. With 17,000 SKUs, we would have 8 of those 20 aisles in a supermarket. So we have a pretty broad base, you know, healthcare solution. The biggest thing that's in my organization is, you know, they're the people that do all the work, is I have about 1,400 people in 68 different countries, and their whole job is every day is working with patients, working with healthcare providers, working with scientists, trying to understand what is the demand based on the healthcare needs, okay? And the reason why I wanted to say this is that we do a lot to make sure that we can interact with patients and with people in need. And that's not just in the Western world, that's anywhere around us. So the COVID vaccine overall, maybe I'll just sort of start by showing you this slide. So first and foremost, science was not necessarily on the side of a vaccine, right? So these are all the vaccine timelines, some of the major ones. Again, this is in the public domain. But what you could see here is when we first started having this challenge, right? And we first started to look at the challenge, there was a lot of time was really against us, right? So you can see from polio down to hepatitis B, all of those timelines to develop vaccines were measured in years. The next shortest one after that was the Ebola virus. And depending on, you know, how you look at that, that vaccine was anywhere from 4 to 5 years. The one that we did for the COVID vaccine was actually 9 months. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you sort of how we did that. But I'm going to show you that in a way that tries to bring together anyone and everyone from around the world and how that got solved. As I like to say, as a systems engineering role, right? A systems engineer. So this here, I'd like to, let me see. I don't know if this will show or not.
I'm a 7th grader in Florida.
I'm a researcher in New Jersey.
I'm a working mom of 3 in California. When schools closed, I didn't get to see my friends for a very long time.
All the stay-at-home orders and lockdowns, the travel industry was really hurt by that.
I had a friend who passed away. He was one of the first individuals to die in New York City from COVID-19.
in order for us to get to the other side of the pandemic, we were going to probably have to have a vaccine, but trials don't just magically get done. They need volunteers.
There was a lot of Asian backlash where the virus was coming from. Felt like there was a duty to participate.
As a kid, it didn't seem like there was much I could do. Participating in the trial was a great way for me to help my community.
I'm absolutely mortified of these, but as someone who conducts research myself, I know how absolutely critical it is for researchers to obtain participants who are eager to assist in the development of good science.
If not me, who? If not now, when? It's not very often in life, the actions of one individual or a group of individuals can actually have an effect that benefits tens of thousands, millions of people. But the idea that in joining a trial, you can be that person is really powerful and also kind of humbling in a way.
It was like the moon landings. I definitely felt like I played a part in making history. That's something I can tell my grandkids about. I participated in something that gave them a future going forward and helped humanity.
It really is probably one of the most important things I've ever done. It's just a real honor, you know, and this is history. This is history.
So if you wanted to know the heroes of any of this, it was those 45,000 people, because science doesn't start without really brave people trusting in something that is, you know, bigger than them. So that was the most diverse clinical trial we ever had, just so you know. So we had 45,000 people. The typical clinical trials, 500 to 1,000 people. We had no issues enrolling anybody. We had no issues with race, gender, anything along those lines. It was the most diverse trial that we've ever run, just so you know. This is a very quick timeline, because what I'd like to do is just kind of walk you through some of the times, right? So a couple things that were happening. So you'll see in the upper left here was January 12th, the Chinese government uploaded, January 12th, 2020, the government uploaded the COVID SARS virus, basically the construct of the virus. We started to notice a few things happening in the quarter before, back in late 2019, because when you're in supply chain, you start to see demand profiles change, right? So what you start to see is you start to see products that are geared towards respiratory, products that are geared towards hospitals. You start to see what's happening. You start to see demand patterns, right? And we knew something was up in the fourth quarter, right? We didn't know what it was, but you see demand patterns. No different than you would see demand patterns. You know, you sell more ice cream in the summer than you do in the winter. Same sort of situation. Our partner BioNTech started to run animal studies at the time here, but what ended up happening is we were in a deal with them for a flu vaccine. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but they came to us with this great technology, but they didn't have the ability. They had great science, but didn't necessarily have the ability or the platform to sort of scale that science, right? And I'll talk a little bit about RNA, but this, we started obviously shared joint trials. Germany started in April. The US, we started in May, right? So those trials go through. We started off with 4 different variants, 4 different types of vaccines. We picked the one in July that had the most efficacy. Okay. And then you run sort of your phase 3 trials, well, your phase 2B and 3. And what ended up happening is late November, we got the data back that it was 91% effective at reducing or eliminating COVID, you know, the contraction of it. And we did everything we could then to rush that out. The point I was trying to make here is this is the scientific path. What I'm going to show you now is the entire parallel manufacturing path. Right? So this whole vaccine was about science, but it was also about supply. Because you can have the best science, and if you can't supply it, then you've got a problem. So this sort of merged both of those together. How did that occur? You know, and I use this analogy all the time, but The largest vaccine up until this point was actually a product called Prevnar, which we manufacture. All right. So it's typically given to infants and or people, older people to basically stop sort of certain respiratory factors. The volume that we were producing at that time, which was the largest vaccine in the world, was 200 million doses. And that 200 million doses at the time was using what I would call traditional vaccine technology, right? Well-established technology. The challenge with trying to take COVID into that sort of vaccine platform is you're only going to be able to reach 200 to 400 million people. And there's pick the number, 7.8, 8 billion people in the world. So we then started to look at what are the different types of technologies, and the RNA platform that I'll show you here in a few moments was really the platform that we believe sort of moved it from the internal combustion engine to the electric car, right? And that's what we were able to do in that 9-month period, is basically switch very rapidly to that. So what I'll talk about here now is sort of the top sort of 3 innovations that we had. Now, by the way, we have hundreds of innovations, but these are the 3 that I thought would be most relevant, sort of in a supply chain engineering science context. All right. So first and foremost, and I'll show you an example that with this new type of technology, we reinvented the entire manufacturing of vaccines. So we didn't necessarily build a network for a couple 100 million people. We built it for billions of people. All right. So that's a big thing. Secondarily is we had to build that network out in a world record time. So we did that across the globe. I'll show you a little bit about how we did that. And then the last thing we had to do is we had to get that product from manufacturing centers into the arms of patients. And one of the challenges with our vaccine, the RNA vaccine, is you need to store it and ship it in ultra cold temperatures, right? Minus 90 degrees Celsius. So if you've ever cut an apple or a banana and you leave it on your counter, you come back 15 minutes later, it's brown. Well, RNA, if you cut that and you leave it on your counter, it goes in 2 nanoseconds. It's gone, right? So I'll talk about that. But one of the ways that you sort of, we got around that is by building out a world-class sort of what we call the deep frozen distribution network, and I'll talk about that. So these are the 3 areas that I'll go into. So, so a little bit of grounding on RNA, just so you know. So traditionally in manufacturing, pharmaceutical manufacturing, you start off with, and this is for now a biological drug. You start off with, you fill your drug your drug product. You then inspect it, you package it, you store, you ship it, and then you get it out, right? That's typically what happens, right? And in most cases, you're buying sort of that active pharmaceutical ingredient, or you're manufacturing yourself. With RNA, what RNA is, and so if you've seen the picture of the spike protein, right? So I'm sorry, if you see a picture of the COVID virus, you see it has spikes all around it. So those spikes are what grabs to your cell, and then it injects all this bad stuff into your cells, which then gets you sick, right? So what we did is we took a piece of the DNA from the spike, okay? And then through a lot of complex technology that I'm not really all that good at, you take that piece of DNA and you convert it into RNA. And then what that RNA is that's a piece of the RNA for the spike. And then you surround that with a fat particle, okay? And the reason why you do that, you surround it within a fat particle, is that as the product gets injected into you, the fat particle dissolves, because all of our bodies are all filled with cholesterol, right? Not in a bad way, but you know what I mean? It dissolves, and then you have this free-floating piece of RNA running around, and your white blood cells see that, and they say, wow, that's a foreign invader. I better start building antibodies up against it, okay? That's basically sort of the technology. So the reason why we chose this technology is that, number one, is it scales very quick. And then what's the other thing you know about viruses? Viruses mutate, right? Which is one of the reasons why, you know, if you ever get a flu vaccines are not necessarily, there's 17 different types of flu, 17 different types. Depending upon the vaccine you get, you may get 1 or 2 or 3 of those types, but you could get infected by type 5, by type 9, by type 16, right? So the beauty of this kind of technology is if a virus mutates or that spike protein mutates, you can take that piece of software and then you can generate basically a new vaccine pretty rapidly, right? So one of the variant, and again, this is all in the public domain, the variant that typically is hitting today in the United States is called the XB1.55 variant, right? And that's a variant that, you know, you can get through this sort of cycle in about 90 days, right? Which in our world is pretty, it's like light speed, right? 90 days. But what you do here is that, you know, the point I was trying to make here is that overnight we became a software company. No different than, you know, Apple or Microsoft or any of the apps sitting on your phone get updates every night, right? We in theory applied that same sort of technology, right, on the software side. So then this is traditional manufacturing, and I wanted to show this. So for any of you that have ever been, and I'm trying to talk about this in an innovative context. If you ever been into a microbrewery, right? Which I've been into quite a few of those, as you can tell from my waistline. What you do here is you start off with a cell bank and flask, and you start, you know, moving up, and you're, you know, in a microbrewery, it's all fermentation, right? It's the same sort of process, and you continue to grow and grow and grow. If you're gonna, this is the technology most vaccine companies use. And the challenge with this type of technology is you eventually run out of those 12,000 liter vessels. There's not enough 12,000 liter vessels in the world to inoculate billions of people. So one of the things we were talking about in that January, February, March timeframe was, where are we gonna, if we use traditional technology, where are we gonna get this amount of vessels? You know, and we were talking to everybody in the industry about who had them, who didn't, how big were they? We were talking to the chemical industry, you know, maybe the regulatory bodies would allow us to use them for chemicals. So there was a whole series of things, and what it ended up becoming is it was going to be too tough to make billions. That's really what it came down to. That was the choice Pfizer made. That was the choice Moderna made. So what you see here is, and again, this is all in the public domain, and I wanted to show you this. So first of all, on the right-hand side, the lower right, I talked about the RNA. If you remember, you know, you take the piece of the spike protein. I talked about the lipid, that's the fat particle, the cholesterol. Those two things get brought together in a pump, right? And there's a whole series of complex sort of software and electrical charging that basically fuses these things, right? But that pump right there that you see, what comes out of the bottom of that is what's called a liquid nanoparticle. So it's very, very small, and that's what becomes the basis of the vaccine. That little pump can sit in the palm of my hand. So rather than using the old technology I showed earlier with massive pumps and massive sterile stainless steel and so on and so forth, we basically decided we couldn't scale up all of the manufacturing because you can't get bigger and bigger. What we did is we reinvented it to scale out. So what you see here is, and we use this sort of analogy, if you've ever been in a data center, a computer data center, you'll see racks and racks and racks of servers. These are racks and racks and racks of manufacturing plants, okay? So each one of those little boxes there is actually a manufacturing plant. And so what we were able to do is each one of those, we built those into arrays, basically what we called LNP, liquid nanoparticle skids. And that was how we scaled out the manufacturing. So in theory, you could scale out infinitesimally as long as you got the pumps. And of course, the secret sauce in that whole manufacturing process was all the software that brought those two things together into that little pump. So that was like the first big manufacturing innovation. Now, it's kind of interesting because, and again, I'm not a doctor, but you can envision one of these pumps in a hospital, right? You can envision, like, if you fast forward, right? You can envision a kind of setup like this, where perhaps, you know, different types of drugs, pharmaceuticals could be made, adjacent in the hospital. That's the holy grail behind some of the current cancer therapies and so on and so forth. But anyway, so that was basically one of the first big innovations. So now that you have all these manufacturing sites, now the question is now you got to scale them up all around the world. And the team I led did this piece of work. So this gives you sort of a size and scale. So we have 280 different components in that vaccine in entirety to make it, right? I only talked about the RNA and the lipids, but there's a lot of stuff that goes in that soup, okay? 280, there's 15 sort of unique materials that are in there. We procured all that through 86 different suppliers all around the world, as you see here, across and produced in 27 manufacturing plants across 19 countries and 4 continents. So this was like truly, that's why I talked about it earlier. It wasn't necessarily a Pfizer thing. It was sort of a world healthcare thing, right? We were using different suppliers, different manufacturers. So the person producing the lipid, which at the time, the lipid suppliers were only supplying the universities, right? So I'm sure the building of arts and, the biology building was probably buying a liter or 2 a year, maybe 3 liters. We were buying thousands and thousands of them to produce, of this. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that you bring together sort of everybody, from around the network, and you're trying to do this in a context that leverages everybody's strengths in order to do this. So this wasn't just a US only, this wasn't just a Western world only, this was from all over the world that helped bring this all together. This is the slide, by the way, I've used before at the World Trade Organization to continue to make sure borders don't go up. Because what's happening now is a lot of countries, rightly so, they want to control their own healthcare destiny. And it's a very difficult thing to do when you've got to produce this whole thing locally, right? And depending on what country you are in the world, it's very challenging to do. So at any rate, so we built this, and the locations of all of that is, this is sort of the map we use. And what you can see here is, as we started to look at the science and the technology, now the question really is where can you manufacture it? And we would manufacture it based upon where those capacities and really human capabilities were in the world. There are certain geographies that have really good capabilities, and you don't necessarily, in this particular space, you can't necessarily find the science everywhere, right? You have to, find the science inside the 4 walls of your country. You have to find it where you can find it. So this is the network design that we built, and we had to do this manufacturing build in parallel of that 9-month scientific effort. So the scientists were going off and they were sort of determining the construct of that RNA. We, at the same point in time, were building out the physical manufacturing, the global manufacturing network in order to do that. So, so then, now that you have the science on how you manufacture, now that you've got sort of a network built for billions, now the last small problem, or actually massive problem, is how do you get it into arms of patients, right? So I talked to you earlier about RNA. RNA doesn't like, warm weather, right, fundamentally. So we had a couple of different choices in there when we were formulating it. And the easiest way to make something from -90 to -20 to 2 to 8 is you could put a preservative in, right? Like there's different formulations you can use. The challenge is with that is every decision we were making, there's a life on the other end of that decision. So if you, what's the cost of delaying a day, a week, a month, a year? What is that? And we decided to go out and start distributing the vaccine at -90 degrees Celsius. And there was a lot of discussion on whether we should or shouldn't do that. Like, should we be trying to go out with something that was a little bit more, something that a doctor could put into a normal refrigerator, right? And the answer is if we did that, we were going to delay everything. And then if you delay everything, how many lives are lost in that delay, right? That's fundamentally what it is. So if you remember, and this was, some of the challenges we were having, there was a lot of press at the time about, the vaccine being, cold chain, right? It was going to be very, very difficult, so on and so forth. The network I'm going to show, the solution that we came up with here now is this. And this is sort of, and I'll start off with the right? So again, having the patient in mind, and we're talking about patients at the billions level, and those patients weren't sitting just in Cleveland or Kingston. They were sitting anywhere in the world, right? So, and they could have been, and, so in our world, one of our company values in Pfizer is equity. And you can see that on our website. So, we believe every patient is equal no matter where they are in the world. So we had to drive, we had to develop sort of a solution that would get the product to people anywhere in the world. So the first thing we had to do was, when you look at the left, rather, I'm sorry. So when you're talking billions, we had to be able to ship this, assemble this in sort of my distribution centers very quick and fast, right? Second thing is we needed the product to be stable for 10 days. What does that mean? That means is that, if we were to ship the product today, it would typically, if it's in the United States, it gets to a point of use, a POU, point of use. It gets there tomorrow. If this product is going to go to Malawi, it may not get there for 3 days, right? And then it may sit in an airport for another day or two, or there may be a customs clearance or something along those lines. So we designed this box, one box, to be sort of the global solution, and we designed it to be like basically a portable freezer, right? So no matter where you were in the world, you were assured that the product was getting there, that way. The other thing we wanted is we wanted it reusable, because we didn't want to necessarily, post-pandemic have a problem where boxes are floating up in the ocean or pollution, so on and so forth. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And then we needed it less than 50 pounds, right? So if you go to an airport and you try to check a bag that's over 50 pounds, they harass you. Well, they were going to harass us too, right? And I don't say that in a bad way. So what we were looking for here is, the ability, the first thing is, how do we use this thermal shipper at the point of use? So we're basically sending them sort of a deep freezer for 10 days. The second thing we also did is we needed to monitor everything. So just when the shipment was going, we actually have, and you can see it up there, the real-time data monitoring. They're called, we use the company Controllant. Controllant was one of the companies that designed this for us. Is that little data logger there talks to the cellular networks all around the world. So no matter where that thing is, it's taking location, geo-tracking, it's looking at temperature, it's looking at humidity, it's looking at a couple of key factors. If there is a deviation anywhere according to our standards, no matter where it was, we typically would catch it right away, and we would catch it in shipment, and we would divert that product back immediately based on the carrier, and then we would replace it before the POU, the point of use, ever knew it. This system here that we do that is that box there was designed by one of my packaging engineers, and that box there, what you can see in the upper left, you'll see something that kind of looks like it's a large white box. We call them inside of Pfizer pizza boxes, right? Because in there went all of the vials. And then what you did is you basically charged that in and you put dry ice around it, so on and so forth. That box there was 99.95% effective at keeping those products. We rarely got a return from anywhere around the world. The only time we got returns, which was about 85% of them, about 80%, I think, was the returns were for recycling. We put another label in there. We said, when you're done, stick it on there, ship it back to us. So all of that. And then in some cases, we were actually able to reuse them, right? So we designed it not only for a patient on the other end that may or may not have had, or POU that may or may not have had a deep frozen freezer. We also did it for, what I would call the circular economy, environmental aspect. So we did that. That box right there, I was saying, is in the Smithsonian Institute today. The gentleman that did all that is brilliant engineer, African-American guy. So him and I, we were down, we're doing some work for Howard University in Washington, DC. They asked us to come down and show us this. And, you know, you don't know what it's like, you know, having, you know, those students sort of see, you know, this material and sort of, you know, what James was able to do was really great. So anyway, that was sort of the third thing that we did. So when you look at it all, this is the number of countries, 181 countries. So everywhere you see as where we ship to, if a country is grayed out, it's typically because they were not necessarily, you know, they were going with another sort of vaccine technology at the time. So it doesn't mean necessarily that we didn't sell there, didn't want to sell there. It's just that that country had other sort of, I would call it sort of patient need, customer needs. But it was that box that basically hit everywhere. All right. And no matter, you know, our sort of thought process is we needed to design an engineering solution that no matter where it was in the world, you could assure when the patient was getting inoculated that it was the real stuff, right? And it was highest quality. So these are some of the just statistics. You know, again, I wanted to sort of show you this here. So when we were, you know, these are some of the things we did, right? So we, you know, obviously reduced cycle time. You know, we scaled up the network. I think I showed you from 6 manufacturing sites to 27 within that 6-month time period. We were doing a lot of work in here, but the important thing is sort of the chart on the right. So this is what, you know, my team and many others were doing as we were trying to build this network out for billions. In July of 2020, right? July of 2020, we only had line of sight to 200 million doses at the time. And remember now, we got this approved in November, right? So when governments were asking, you know, how much can you produce? We're like 200 million for 21, right? And then we started to look at things differently. We started to think of things differently. We started to scale up. We started to do different things. We started to engage other companies, other, you know, sort of suppliers. We then got to 600 million. 3 months later, 1.3 billion. Actually, in 2021, we actually shipped 3 billion doses. And last year in 2022, we had the network built for 4 billion. We didn't ship 4 billion because it started to wane, but it was basically, we had the capacity for 4 billion doses. And I told you earlier that the number one vaccine before this was Prevnar, 200 million doses. So you can see, you know, you guys can do the math. We were able to sort of, you know, get, you know, basically scale up that network to do anything beyond we ever thought. So a lot of people ask about sort of this topic is like, you know, what did you learn? What's some of the things? So this is, again, in the public domain. Leading through uncertainty. If you want to talk about uncertainty, this is basically from December 7th of 2020, right? All the way down through like late last summer. And what this shows here is the different variants of the vaccine. So the gray area here is the original strain. So December 8th, when they did all of the work to say, you know, what is the strain of this vaccine? It was the original strain, right? And then what starts to happen over time is the strains start to mutate. So what happens here, the dark blue, you then get an alpha strain, you then come into the delta strains. Now, you know, we didn't hear a lot about this in the summer times, right? But then what happens is this thing, as viruses are really good at, they find ways to get around things, right? So the real question that we had, and what you can see over here on the right-hand side, you know, is you start to see basically all the Omicron variants now. And now there's new variants. Now the XBB variant is now the other one that's happening now. So as we go from pandemic, where you're trying to get everybody inoculated as fast as possible, right, with that spike protein. And remember, every one of these things has a spike on it, right? But some of these viruses can get around, right? So what's happening now is we've been migrating from, you know, how do we get billions out to now, how do we get reaction time for this for you know, the new, what I would classify seasonality associated with the vaccine, right? So just like some people may take the flu vaccine, you know, every fall, right? It's probably a good bet that if people that took the flu will probably take this, you know? But the question is you don't want to necessarily take a vaccine for a construct, for a virus construct that isn't necessarily the most prevalent at the time. So the other thing we're doing now is we're trying to build in sort of the speed into our whole decision-making and our network on how we basically, how do we get as close as possible to the variants that are hitting at that point in time to make the vaccine the most effective, right? So that's basically, you know, the situation. So my point is it's a moving target, right? That's the challenge with viruses. It's a moving target. So, so the things that we've been doing is, you know, I talk about response versus reaction is always the way that I describe this. So first and foremost, you know, we keep the patient first in everything we do. And that sounds so trivial at times to different people, but I always like to say it, you know, we had a choice to make, and we made a choice instead of servicing a few people would probably that look like me to servicing billions of people, you know, across. So that was a pretty big choice. And the pretty big choice in that was patients first, right? No matter where the patient is. All focus on speed, agility, you know, and all sorts of innovation. The biggest thing we had to do was basically number 3. And that's sort of the thing that I sort of saw is any sort of human organization, no matter who it is, has bureaucracy. And in bureaucracy, you can hide for many, many, you know, days, months, and years. When you're in a pandemic, you know, we immediately pivoted this culture to what we would call the Lightspeed culture. And what that basically was if you were part of the vaccine, you were on what's called a Lightspeed project, right? By the way, I was not on the Lightspeed project, but I had people in my organization that were. I wouldn't go to the meetings, they would go, right? They were the people that were empowered to make decisions. And culturally, in a bureaucracy, that's really difficult, right? No matter what bureaucracy you're in, right? It could be anything. You know, there's always this hierarchical sort of what I would call vertical sort of, you know, order of the way life works, right? In this effort, everything went from vertical to horizontal, okay? And in my world is if you weren't on the vaccine, then you were doing everything you could to keep all those other products in stock. Because Pfizer manufactures 40% of the hospital products sold in the United States, as an example. 40% of the rooms, you know, 40% of the operations today are all, you know, there's a Pfizer product when you wake up or when you go to sleep. If you weren't working on the vaccine, I wanted you working on all those other products to keep the entire health system working, right? So even though you weren't on the team, you were there, right? But you weren't necessarily in the decision. So that was a tough thing to do for many people, but fortunately for our CEO and our senior leadership team, it was really a rapid sort of horizontal, you know, cultural shift immediately. And what helped was the fact that at the end of the line was a patient, right? Somebody that hopefully, you know, that you saved. And then the other thing we did, and I talk about this, it's really more the risk management side. Just so you know, we put about $2 billion of our own money at risk in order to develop this. And there's not a lot of companies that would do that, right? That's sort of another thing. And again, the reason why, and I don't say that in a arrogant way, but if you're going to put $2 billion, you're going to do it because of that, right? So, and I'll give you a few statistics here shortly. By the way, I just sort of wrote these down because this came out this morning. By the way, these are all publicly validated numbers, but I just want to give it to you in a US context, right? So this has all been validated through CDC and other public sources. Now, again, by the way, I'm a big believer in science. So, you know, and I'm a big believer that, you know, you fight healthcare with science as opposed to political policy. But in the United States, since December 2020 to March 2022, right? Like these are all validated. By the way, this isn't Pfizer, this is the industry, right? 2.3 million deaths avoided, 17 million hospitalizations avoided because of the vaccines, 66 million infections avoided, right? 900 billion, almost $1 trillion in healthcare savings to the US hospital system, right? You know, you could argue, they say somewhere about $500 million in GDP because people were back to work. So, by the way, that's what I just described to you is your classic pharmacoeconomics model that you see everywhere except for certain places in the United States, right or wrong. Anyway, so look, I'll conclude it all by just saying this is hopefully I gave you sort of the view of, you know, how we were able to sort of change this. Again, I represent, you know, a lot of people. And I guess at the end of the day, like I'm, you know, just proud that I was a part of it and proud I'm an alumni of this university, right? To be a part of that also, because many people come up to me and, you know, they're looking at my LinkedIn profile or so on and so forth. And I'm really proud to say that URI was much harder than Wharton from a gray matter perspective. All right. So, so at any rate, it was all my tough engineering professors. So there you go. So thank you. Yeah, sure. So we didn't have, so Pfizer had a pretty big animal health business. We spun that business off before the pandemic. So you had some experts from that business that were around, but no, we didn't use any of those facilities. Yeah, that's what happens. Yeah. Sure, go ahead. It was just the expertise of what we had and the capacity we had. So majority of the DNA, the plasma DNA, we were making in St. Louis, and then we were moving it to Andover, which is our facility about 60 miles north of here. It was just basically capacity. It was a lot of it was capacity and how fast we can get it. Yeah. I had one in the back here, sorry. Yeah, there is. So this type of technology that I talked about, RNA, and by the way, there's many, I'm not a biologist, but I think there's a whole renaissance of healthcare underway right now. Okay. Massive changes, right? This RNA technology is one example. So we use the RNA for a vaccine. You can use the RNA if you wanted to. Think about it if you have a cancer cell, right? So think about, you know, God forbid you have a cancer cell inside of your body, somebody harvests, you know, cancer's got a great cloaking mechanism, right? That's fundamentally what it is. And you can harvest a piece of that and think about producing that vaccine, and then you could put it back into you. And now all of a sudden your white blood cells wake up, right? And now they can see things, right? So that's like a good example of that. So the long story short, there's a lot of different applications in what we call our Lightspeed culture that we're deploying to a lot now of our new innovative programs, right? Specifically a lot in oncology, rare disease, vaccines. So like, as an example, we're working on, so oncology it was an interesting one because it's very, you know, just like that virus, that single virus mutates on, you know, oncology's got you know, depending on the cell and all sorts of things, you could probably have that whole map go out for miles. But there's different types of that Lightspeed technology, that culture that we're using now. So within Pfizer now, there's 19 different Lightspeed projects, all aimed at getting that science to patients as quick as possible. So it is sticking. We didn't hire any of the technical aspects. What we did a lot was leveraged the expertise of other companies. Is probably the best way. So as an example, we didn't have any real scale technology in the lipid production area, but we used companies that did. So, and by the way, Moderna did too, right? So like we were doing a lot of work with those. So the scientific side of it wasn't necessarily hiring internal as much as pulling together a tapestry of experts in order to do it. So in fact, that's a big mistake a lot of companies make, is they think they can do all this stuff internally. And then when they can do it all internally, they get bogged down. Because the scientific renaissance I'm talking about it's happening so fast that there's experts everywhere that have developed a technology that are probably better than we could have done it. Yeah. Yeah, so it was different country by country, right? Clearly. We, in all cases, including the US, we sold this to the governments, okay? And let them handle the politics, right? And then most of the governments were the ones that were buying it. So there was something in it to them, for them to get it in. With that being said, there are certain countries. So we had a heat map. I put together for my group a heat map, right? For that we would talk to the governments about. There are certain countries where you can get an export in or an import in pretty quickly, right? United States, you can come in. It's like going through the fast lane at the airport, right? There are certain countries, they were telling us, well, it's going to take you 40 days to get it in. And my response, not mine, but our people's response was, well, how many people die in 40 days? You know? So we had to do a lot of education on trade and customs organizations and so on. Like I said, by the way, governments bent over backwards in order to get this there. So I don't want to I'm not denigrating any government anywhere globally. But just because somebody in the healthcare department felt this doesn't necessarily mean trade and customs felt that. So we had to do a lot of that stakeholder management. We did that country by country by country by country. So I had we had a heat map of the countries that were really great to deal with. You know, we put them in the green zone, and then we had the countries that were really horrible, which were in the red zone. And we would show them this, and we'd say, hey, you know what? You're in the red zone. Now, do you want to be in the green zone? This is what we need to do, you know? So anyway, and we'd let them make the choice, really. So, yeah. Yeah, so we have a very, we have a real robust process on how we bring a product to market. It's like a life cycle. So, you know, and I'm gonna give you this in sort of macro terms, right? So you have a research, you have a development, you have what we call the pharmaceutical sciences, which fundamentally develops the manufacturing process at a bench scale. And then you bring it over into our manufacturing world. And my partner, Pam Seawick, she's in charge for the scale-up process. And then my team then starts to build out the logistics networks, the storage, all that. So we have a whole set of functions. And what we did is we took, you know, the experts out of each one of the functions and then dedicated them to this Lightspeed project. And they basically were accountable to Lightspeed. They weren't accountable to me anymore in my world. Now, they still work for me. I still gave them performance appraisals. And by the way, I was exceptionally comfortable with that. Not every organization, not every bureaucracy would like that, right? So, yeah, you guys see Hamilton, right? Yeah, Hamilton, you know, I want to be in the room where it happened. But I was really comfortable with not being in the room where it happened. Because, you know, I tell you, we have 500 products, we have 499 other ones, right? So at any rate, so that's basically how we did that. And by the way, it was all ages and sizes and everything from all over. So, you know, at any rate. Yeah. So you know, when we bring something from our pharmaceutical sciences, they develop like the bench level, you know, and scale up too. I don't want to say, and by the way, a lot of that happens in Groton, Andover, St. Louis, Europe. What ends up happening is that there's a handoff to our manufacturing organization. And my peer, I have two peers. One is, her name is Pam Seawick. She does everything launch. So she's trying to do everything she can to get the product through and land it in those sites. And then I have another peer of mine, Roberto Silveira. He was the guy that was in charge of, basically, his team was doing all of the work, procure the pumps, do everything we could to run all the studies. And the hardest thing to do on all that was the software to control the pumps. That's the IP. That's the secret sauce. It's the reason why Apple will never give you their, you know, their operating system, or others won't, right? That was sort of that was it. So that all got done exceptionally rapidly. By the way, the other thing too is, our CEO and CFO was like, money was no object. So the other thing is, we were doing everything we could to go as fast as possible. Now, by the way, we're back to reality, just so you know. So anyway, but that's how it happened. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, right now. So is your question about, are we looking for communities like where there's rare diseases and things like that? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I got it now. Yeah. So, okay. So what we did, a couple things. So we built that network for speed, right? Now, with that being said, we have a really good manufacturing partner in Brazil, which manufactures for Latin America. We have a really good manufacturing partner, Biovac, in South Africa. So the other thing we do, what we did, but we built that network for speed to get it out. So the speed, you know, you need a critical mass of the skills and technologies. What's happening now is there's almost like, we're working now with various countries on like what we would call a healthcare ecosystem, right? So how do you fundamentally, well, there's two things we're doing. One is, we're on the ecosystem side, is we're approaching governments now, not only about selling products, but selling our expertise. Okay, so that's one thing. And there's a lot of governments, mostly the larger, you know, countries, you know, Brazil, Malaysia, those places. You know, they want to be on sort of the, you know, they want to be in this sort of game, right? The other thing we're doing more for broader healthcare, this is like vaccine number 2. And you could look at this, it's public. Our CEO announced at Davos back in, I think it was in February, that we're offering all 500 of our products for no cost. I'm sorry, for cost to the low and middle income countries. So that's the other thing that we've been doing from a healthcare offering perspective. Now, the one thing I didn't show you with the vaccine is that we have and I showed it, and I'm sorry I went over it. I have distribution centers in 125 of those 181. We have supply chain teams in each one of those. We may or may not be manufacturing in those countries. And a lot of that is just based upon the local expertise. It's not that we won't, but we, it's your classic, situation of that. So, but there are countries that are really focusing quite a bit on this now and are asking us to localize manufacturing. But it's not just localizing the manufacturing. You want to localize clinical trials. You want to be giving money to universities. You want to be training the next scientists. It's more of an ecosystem than it is just sort of, putting a packaging operation there. So. Yeah, right. I'm not in development though. Sure, go ahead. So we worked closely with those partners I talked about. I had 85 suppliers, right? Those are the people we work closely with. There was a lot of collegiality in the industry at the time, but it was collegiality for the first 4 or 5 months because J&J chose one technology, AstraZeneca chose another, and we chose one, and Moderna chose theirs. So, very quickly you part, not because you want to, but it just happens. That's really the way that occurred. Yeah. So, yeah, go ahead, Andy. So they went entirely outside is the first thing. Well, a couple things with Moderna. First of all, great company, really great company. Their product wasn't -80. Theirs was, I think, -20. So they had some advantages from a distribution perspective. Their entire manufacturing network was externalized. And they did that because they were a biotech company, right? And biotech companies are about the science, and they get other people to do the manufacturing. And that's kind of where they were. Very similar with the BioNTech team, they were the scientists, we had the manufacturing platform. So they produced, I think, we produced 3 billion in 21. I think Moderna was around 750 million. But for a biotech company with that's amazing. Like I'm in awe of those guys. But that's probably what they did that was different, and internal versus external. A lot of it is the same technology at its roots. Yeah. So with the vaccine, it was produce as much as you can, as fast as you can, because nobody could produce it. Nobody could produce it at scale, right? So it was produce as much as you can. With other diseases, states, we forecast a lot of this. So we have 17,000 SKUs. 50% of those are actually forecasted by AI machine learning. So a human doesn't touch them. So based on sales patterns and based upon inventory and based upon lead time, it's a giant mathematical equation, and it runs through a mathematical model, and it spits out, this is what we're going to sell. So about 9,000 of those. The other 9,000, my team sits with every country manager, every market-based supply chain team, and they go through what's called a brand forecast review monthly, all the time. What are we going to sell? What do you, are there any conferences coming up? Is there any demand? So on and so, it's like, so an example, like we sell transplant drugs. Well, if there's a transplant conference where one of our scientists presents, it typically will drive demand. So it's those sorts of things we do. So that happens, and then we roll all that up every night of the week, and then my team sends out all the production plans to replenish out of the 37 internal sites and 300 external. Sure. Yeah, there were, in the beginning, when in the height of the COVID situation, very few, if any, went under, like what I would call expired. We did have countries that couldn't get it into the arms of people because their healthcare system wasn't geared for it. Right? Mostly low and middle income countries. So we could land the product. We couldn't get it into arms of people. Not we, but they couldn't. So there was issues there, right? What's happened now is as that wave is moved, the original versions we have aren't as most effective. So we've come out with a Rev 2, a Rev 3, a Rev 4, a Rev 5, so to speak. That's what sells. So you by default always have a constant situation of it's perishable is really the vaccine. It's like no different than vegetables or fruits in a supermarket, right? So that's really what happens. So, yeah. Are you an engineer? Okay, great. Yes. But I've been hiring those kinds for a long time, just so you know. Yeah. So, yeah. Well, this is my first time back in 15 years. So I promise you. Maybe you. Are you graduating? Oh, are you? Okay, got it. Oh, you'd cost us more money then. So here's what I say to, because I get that question a lot, actually, but funny enough, from students. So here's what I say, which you guys may or may not like, but I say it. In a university setting, you're tested on your IQ every day of the week. IQ, 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 every day of the week. When you get out into other applications, like in the business world, your IQ is worth something, but now it starts to get into your EQ, your emotional quotient. Okay. So as an example, I have PhD mathematicians in my group. I would never put them in front of a commercial person because they don't have the skills necessarily they don't have the right brain, creative, emotional, but skills in order to do that. So what I look for is a whole brain type of person, somebody that is very analytical, project oriented, structured, and disciplined, but somebody that can really operate on the right brain with creativity and innovation. And that is a tough thing to find. And it's a tough thing to find as an undergraduate because they're not taught that yet. They're taught very left brain, like your teacher, with no disrespect, right? That's what happens, right? So what ends up happening, it's kind of interesting because we see it all the time, is the first time people start to learn about that is when they get into the working world. And then they start to say, wow, I don't really want to be a bench level chemist anymore. I just hired a young lady actually a couple of days ago. She was she's a biologist and she's worked in one of our manufacturing sites. And she's like, I just don't want to do the science anymore. Like I really want to do, so like, that's the kinds of things that, so we find a lot of people that go from the science over. Now, engineer, what school are you in? Yeah. Civil and environmental. Okay. So I'm an industrial engineer, right? So I believe engineering is a horizontal science, right? That's my view, which is one of the reasons why I think I was so good for supply chain, my skill set, because it's horizontal. What I loved about engineering, as you spend time in electrical and these other places, is you learn just enough not to get snowed. That's what so that's the other thing I would sort of say. So yeah, so the person we're hiring today is a lot more well-rounded, which by the way, that's what the students are, that's what they're looking at now. the students we're interviewing now, they don't, you know, they love our mission, don't get me wrong, but they're like, what are you doing for the environment? What are you doing? You know, they're not asking like when I was coming out, there was a whole different, you know, I was just trying to not eat vegetables and, you know, cheese anymore, you know, and hot dogs. Yeah. I think it'll definitely come together faster. Yeah. I mean, a couple things. One is governments now know that they shouldn't get caught out anymore. Like, you know, I showed you those, I gave you those results in the US. If you go ex-US, most of those healthcare systems are pretty well organized around what is the cost of a disease. You know, I lived in Europe for many years and, you know, like when I lived in the UK, they have the National Institute of Clinical Evaluation. I don't know if it's still called that, but, you know, basically they go through the whole pharmacoeconomics of what's a disease burden in a hospital versus a preventative, right? So I think there's a lot of governments that are aware of it now. I think there's a lot of companies that are, you know, organized in positions sort of, you know, all over the ecosystem. I think the countries, by the way, this is just fact, the countries that did really well during this solved all this with healthcare policy, not political policy. So, you know, so yeah, I do believe the world's better off at this day. And, you know, we'll sort of see, you know, let's hope there's not another pandemic, right? So. Yeah, thank you. All right, great.